Hello and welcome to your digital classroom study with Sudhir, and I am TS Sudhir. Today we are going to read a story and understand a story by one of the most prolific authors from India, Ruskin Bond. And the story is called A Face in the Dark. A Face in the Dark. And the moment you hear the title, you'll probably get some kind of an idea because it's a very intriguing title. A Face in the Dark. How do you see a face in the dark? So the word face and the word dark, really the two most important elements of the title itself, and they make the person who is going to read the story very intrigued and curious to know what exactly is there in this short story by Ruskin Bond. But you should also know a little bit about who Ruskin Bond is. Ruskin Bond is an Indian author of British descent, and he is, as I said, a very prolific writer whose works are very popular both with adults as well as with children, and you should probably read some of his other works also, so to get an idea about the kind of writing that Ruskin Bond does. And in this particular story, it is set in the city of Shimla, which is the capital city, as you know, of Himachal Pradesh. So and it's very interesting how Ruskin Bond uses the geography of Shimla to kind of create a very thrilling kind of an episode in the day of a teacher who teaches at the school in Shimla. So let's start with the story. I'll go through the story, and then of course I will also give you different interpretations. And I must tell you, this story is probably one of the most fascinating that you have in the ICSE board syllabus, which is probably one of the most fascinating stories for the sheer different kind of interpretations that you can possibly give to just this two-page story in the ICSE class 10 syllabus. And these are some of the elements, and I would be going through each one of the elements after we have finished with the story. So let's start. Keep your book right in front of you, open. Keep a pencil with you so that you can underline, and each of the words that I keep explaining, please write it on the side of the book so that the next time that you're reading the story, you would be able to recall, okay, this is what was taught to us in the digital classroom of study with Sudhir. This is what was told to us, and it will actually be able to, you'll be able to retain it in your memory and actually reproduce it in the answer sheet in the examination hall. So that is something which I really rely on. As I have said in my earlier videos, visual memory plays a very important role in the life of a student. So do write it clearly with a pencil on the side so that every time you read it again, you would be able to see it and understand it much better. So let's get started. Keep your books open and keep the pencil in your hand. Mr. Oliver, an Anglo-Indian teacher, was returning to his school late one night on the outskirts of the hill station of Shimla. An Anglo-Indian teacher, it means settled in India during British rule. His parents may have been British, or one parent, father may have been British and the mother Indian, or the other way around. An Anglo-Indian teacher was returning to his school late one night on the outskirts of the hill station of Shimla. So he's established Shimla, which is a hill station, the capital city of Himachal Pradesh, and Mr. Oliver was coming back to the school late in the evening. So it would have been around 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock. He hasn't mentioned the time, but that's a rough idea that we get from the first sentence of this story. From before Kipling's time, this is a reference to another big author, Rudyard Kipling. And you must have read some of the works of Rudyard Kipling. If not, do look up Rudyard Kipling just for curiosity's sake as to what a big author, and his stories have also been set in India. So he says from before Rudyard Kipling's time, the school had been run on the English public school lines. That is, the school where Mr. Oliver taught was a public school whose syllabus and the manner of teaching and the curriculum was entirely inspired from the British education system. And the boys, most of them from wealthy Indian families, wore blazers, caps and ties. Now this is in contrast to say a government school in those days where things were not very good, but this particular public school whose education system, the curriculum, the syllabus was all inspired from the British system, there the students came from wealthy Indian families. So you are also kind of immediately setting what kind of socio-economic strata, what kind of socio-economic background, wealthy background the students who were studying in that particular school came from. And the boys wore blazers, caps and ties. That again gives you an idea about the kind of affluence, about the kind of wealthy background families that these students came from, and the school also kind of reinforced that particular image of the student. Get the idea? Okay. Life magazine. Now, Life magazine again is one of the most famous magazines in the world. In a feature on India, in a feature that it had done on India, had once called it the Eton of the East. What is Eton of the East? Now, Eton College is a college in Windsor in England. It's a boys' school with about 1300 students, and it's considered again one of the most prestigious educational institutions in the UK. And this Life magazine in its article on India had referred to this particular school where Mr. Oliver was a teacher as the Eton of the East. And Mr. Oliver had been teaching in the school for several years. So he was a very senior teacher at this particular school, and he had been teaching there for many years. Now, the Shimla Bazaar with its cinemas and restaurants was about 3 miles from the school. And Mr. Oliver, a bachelor. So you are being given details about Mr. Oliver and also about the school in the setting of the hill station of Shimla. The Shimla Bazaar, which is obviously one of the central parts of the city with its cinemas and restaurants, was about 3 miles from the school. So whenever he had to go to the Shimla Bazaar, and he's obviously returning to the school late in the evening, he has to travel the distance of 3 miles. And Mr. Oliver, who is a bachelor, he's not married, usually strolled into the town in the evening. So this was his regular kind of a routine, that after school hours he probably went to the Shimla Bazaar, he probably saw a movie or probably had dinner at the restaurants there, and then he came back walking those 3 miles back to the school late in the evening when it was dark, returning after dark, when he would take a shortcut through the pine forest. Now, when he would come back, he would take a shortcut through the pine forest. He wouldn't take the main road. So, Ruskin Bond, in a very, very deft manner, in a very smart manner, in a very smooth and clever manner, is doing the setting for what is going to follow in the story. Because it is a thriller, the word pine forest immediately gives you a sense of what could possibly happen. There is a sense of something very mysterious in the pine forest, because obviously when it is a forest, you are not going to find any human beings there, highly unlikely to. Pine forest, again, you would have read in your geography books or probably biology books as well, they are long trees which give you a sense of dense vegetation. So it's a sense, and moreover it is dark, so you get a sense of something very, very mysterious and thrilling which is likely to follow. The setting is extremely mysterious. When there was a strong wind, please make a note, when there was a strong wind, the pine trees made sad, eerie sounds that kept most people to the main road. Sad and eerie. Eerie is what? Eerie is something which is scary and gives you a very haunting sense. It's like when the wind blows and then there are those trees which sway, they give you a woo kind of a noise. You would have seen it either in the movies or you would have probably experienced it yourself when you went to some hill station, that they give you a very eerie kind of a sound, and more so when it is dark. When it is dark and those kind of sounds come, you could possibly feel very scared. At the same time, this sound is also very sad. So he's using two adjectives, sad and eerie, for the sound that is created by the pine forest whenever there are strong winds blowing through this pine forest. But Mr. Oliver was not a nervous or an imaginative man. So Ruskin Bond is making it very clear that he was neither nervous, which means he was not a scared type, which is why every day he took the risk of actually taking a shortcut instead of taking the main road where there would be other people, but obviously a longer route. He would actually go through the shortcut through this pine forest despite the fact that they would be making these sad and eerie sounds. Nor was he an imaginative man, which means he was not someone who would actually imagine things that something like this is happening, or there is somebody else in the forest with him, or there is some animal there. He was not an imaginative type, nor he was a scared kind. He carried a torch. And that's almost like his weapon that would keep him, that would illuminate his path, that would put light on his path and ensure that he is able to travel the distance of 3 miles back to the school in the darkness. And its gleam, the torch, you would have seen a torch. which kind of throws light into the path. The batteries were running down, moved fitfully down the narrow forest path. Now there is a twist here. Ruskin Bond, in a very, very smart manner, is preparing you for what is likely to happen. He carried a torch, which should actually ideally give you a very, very bright gleam. But in this case, that particular evening, the batteries were running down, which means that the gleam was not very, very strong. It was actually going a little dim, which means it was not able to illuminate a larger path, a longer path as it would have if the batteries were fresh and full. Understood? Now it moved fitfully. Fitfully is fitfully down the narrow forest path. It kind of moved there on the narrow forest path because there is no road there. It is just a pathway which has been created by people walking through the forest. When its flickering light fell on the figure of a boy, now suddenly Mr. Oliver spots a boy out there, and his torchlight, though it's not very sharp, though it's not very strong, it falls on the figure of a boy who is sitting there inside the pine forest, who was sitting alone on a rock. Mr. Oliver stopped. Boys were not supposed to be out after dark. He understood that this boy possibly is from his school, but what was he doing there? Because boys were not meant to be out after it was dark. It was not allowed under the school rules. "What are you doing out here, boy?" asked Mr. Oliver sharply. There was a sharpness to the tone because he's obviously not happy, not amused at seeing that boy after school hours and obviously defying, breaking the rules of the school. Moving closer so that he could recognize the miscreant. Miscreant means the offender, someone who has broken the rules. But even as he approached the boy, Mr. Oliver sensed that something was wrong. The boy appeared to be crying. His head hung down. He held his face in his hands and his body shook convulsively. You get the image? The boy is crying. The boy appeared to be crying because he's hearing the sobbing sound of the boy. His head was hung down. He held his face in his hands like this, and his body shook convulsively. So it is a very nervous kind of a boy's image that Mr. Oliver sees. That he's not able to see the face because his face is put down, but his body is shaking and he appeared to be crying. It was a strange, soundless weeping, and Mr. Oliver felt distinctively uneasy. Yet another moment where Mr. Oliver is seeing the student in a particular way, because of which he feels extremely uneasy, because he says it was a strange, soundless weeping. He appeared to be crying. He doesn't say he's crying. The phrase used is the boy appeared to be crying, and it was a strange, soundless weeping. He couldn't hear him weep, but he appeared to be weeping because of the manner in which the body was shaking convulsively, shaking in a slightly aggressive manner, in a rough kind of a manner. "Well, what's the matter?" he asked, his anger giving way to concern. Now he's a little worried for the boy who is having broken the rules, has come out of the school, and now he seems to be in some kind of trouble because he seems to be crying. "What are you crying for?" The boy would not answer or look up. Mr. Oliver still hasn't seen the face of the student because he would not look up. His body continued to be racked with silent sobbing. The body continued to be racked as in he's still seeing that the body is shaking because of the silent sobbing. "Come on, boy, you shouldn't be out here at this hour." Now Mr. Oliver is telling him the rules. "Boy, you are not meant to be outside here at this time of the day because it's dark and it's against the rules of the school. Tell me the trouble. Look up," because he wants to see the face and identify who the boy is, who the miscreant is. The boy looked up. After all the instructions given by Mr. Oliver, the boy finally looked up. He took his hands from his face and looked up at his teacher, looked up at Mr. Oliver. The light from Mr. Oliver's torch fell on the boy's face, if you could call it a face. Notice the use of the long dash, and he says, if you could call it a face. It had no eyes, no ears, no nose and no mouth. It was just a round, smooth head with a school cap on top of it. And that's where the story should end. But for Mr. Oliver, it did not end here. So he saw the face, because after the boy removed the hands, and he saw that you could not call it a face because it had no eyes, no ears, no nose and no mouth. So how was the boy sobbing? Obviously Mr. Oliver was possibly imagining, even though Ruskin Bond has earlier said that he was not a nervous or an imaginative man. But here, when he sees the face with no mouth, no nose, no ears and no eyes, how could he have possibly been crying without any of these organs on his face? Very, very strange. The torch fell from his trembling hand. Now the other contradiction. Ruskin Bond has told you that he is not a nervous man, but now obviously he gets scared on seeing a face like this which has none of the features that a face should normally have. The torch fell from his trembling hand. He turned and scrambled down the path. Scrambled as in run fast, but not in a regular manner. He is nervous, he is scared. So that is kind of reflecting in the manner in which he runs. He runs almost in a zigzag kind of fashion, nervously. His legs are probably wobbling a bit, not very steady, and he's just running almost helter-skelter, running blindly through the trees and calling for help. You can picturize, you can imagine how Mr. Oliver would have reacted on seeing such a scary kind of a non-face. It's a face, but it's not a face. So he's running, he's crying for help, probably his throat has gone parched, and he's running blindly. Blindly, the word blindly is used because one, he's not able to see because the torch has already fallen down. So he can't see. So he's almost like a blind man in the darkness through the pine forest. But possibly because it's a regular route, he's still able to find his way, but he's blind. He's just running like a blind man and calling for help. He was still running towards the school buildings when he saw a lantern swinging in the middle of the path. There comes someone to rescue him. He was still running towards the school when he see a lantern being held by someone. Mr. Oliver stumbled up to the watchman, gasping for breath. "What is it, Sahib?" asked the watchman. "Has there been an accident? What are you running?" Because Mr. Oliver is relieved at finding someone else, and the watchman comes there and he says, "What is it, Sahib? Has there been an accident? Why are you like this? Why are you gasping for breath? And why are you running like this?" "I saw something horrible, a boy weeping in the forest, and he had no face." So Mr. Oliver, even though he's very, very shaken, he tells the details to the watchman that I saw a boy in the forest, he was weeping, but he had no face. "No face, Sahib?" "Yes, no eyes, no nose, no mouth, nothing." "Do you mean it was like this, Sahib?" asked the watchman and raised the lamp to his own face. The watchman had no eyes, no ears, no features at all, just like the boy. He did not even have an eyebrow. And that's where the wind blew the lamp out. Lamp as in the lantern. So he has seen two people with identical features. In the case of the watchman, he did not even have an eyebrow, though in the case of the boy, he did not tell whether he had an eyebrow or not. But this person was identical to the boy that he had seen in the forest. And the lamp also went out. It was completely pitch dark. Ruskin Bond leaves us in complete suspense as to what Mr. Oliver had actually seen. And that's why this story is so very fascinating, because just like I gave it a lot of interpretations, I'm sure your mind is also going around with lots of interpretations as to what possibly happened inside the pine forest. Who did Mr. Oliver see both in the forest and near the school? What could have possibly happened, and how can we kind of analyze this particular story in the overall context of the school system that Ruskin Bond has told us in the first two paragraphs. So we'll now go across and look at the interpretation of the story, and I can tell you that it is possibly as exciting as the story itself. Now these are the 3-4 main theme points that I have thought of as far as this particular story is concerned. Now Ruskin Bond talks about the school right at the beginning of the story, and he also tells us that this school is very much following the English public school system, right? It is, to my mind, and I would want you to write it down, and I would go through it very slowly because these are important points. So if you have a sheet of paper kept to you, if you don't have it, please pause the video, go and get a notebook, get a sheet of paper, get a pen, so that you can just write it down, because these will be important points when you look at the analysis of the story as to what did the story really want to convey. So the story by Ruskin Bond, A Face in the Dark, is a commentary on the English public school system practiced in India, in cities like Shimla, right? Because it is based on what was being practiced in the UK at that point in time. Ruskin Bond obviously is making the larger point that the education system of this kind is producing students like a factory. You know what is a factory? In a factory, whatever, say for instance in a factory producing soaps, all soaps will be of the same size, having identical weight, having the same chemicals, each one of them. So you cannot distinguish one soap from another soap bar from another soap bar. They're all identical. They have no individuality. All soap bars are just the same. Ruskin Bond believes that the education system being practiced in India, the public school system, was also producing students like a factory. And it was actually killing their individuality, which is why when he sees the student, he can identify the student by what? By the school cap. By the school cap and the fact that he was a student. But then there is no individuality to the student because he had no nose, no eyes, no mouth, no ears. So in that sense, there is no individuality to the student. The only thing that he knew was the school cap, by which he identified that, okay, this boy belongs to my school in Shimla. Because it is the eyes and the ears that distinguish you from me, you from another student, from your friend. Each one of us is very different. But if we do not have our nose and eyes and ears and mouth, all of us, like a round figure, would look just the same. And that's precisely what was kind of happening. So Ruskin Bond is conveying that the students have become all alike. Understood? Have become all alike. There is no distinguishing feature about them. The fact that the student is crying, it also perhaps is being used by Ruskin Bond to convey that the students are not very happy with the state of education, with the manner in which they are being taught, imparted education in that school in Shimla. Okay. The other important point that we see in this particular story is that Mr. Oliver's torch is running out. It's running short on battery. And therefore, he cannot throw much light on the students at the school. It is also, how do we interpret something like this? I interpret it like it is the inability of Mr. Oliver, because the first reaction of Mr. Oliver, the moment he sees the student, is he wanted to recognize the miscreant. Understood? He wants to recognize the miscreant. So it is a slightly disciplinarian kind of an attitude. It is an authoritative kind of an attitude that, oh, I have seen this boy, he deserves to be punished, and that's why the use of the word miscreant. So the battery that is, the torch that is running out of battery, the torch is supposed to illuminate, to enlighten Mr. Oliver, but it is running out of battery, which means that he does not have the wherewithal, he does not have the ability. He does not have the ability to be able to identify and understand the students in order to be able to make them better human beings, better students, make them excel in life. He may be able to get them good marks, but he may not be able to make them excel in life. So it's an inability of the teacher to understand what he has done over the years. He does not even understand, because over the years he has been producing a lot of these students, but there's almost like a conveyor belt. At the airport, you would have seen the luggage keeps coming in the conveyor belt and it keeps going round and round and round. It's exactly the same. The students have also been coming out of this conveyor belt at this particular Shimla school, identical, without Mr. Oliver looking at that, the fact that each student is very different. Each student needs a very different kind of an orientation and focus in order to be able to mold them into excellent individuals. By making the watchman also faceless. Now comes the other point. The watchman also was faceless. Ruskin Bond is hinting at the fact that everyone associated with that particular school also has no individuality. They're all just part of the school system, but they do not have any individuality, which is why there are no names given. Only Mr. Oliver is identified in this short story by Ruskin Bond. The second point that I want to make is that the story is obviously a work of fiction in the supernatural genre. Now, obviously, all this could have been Oliver's imagination. This may just not have happened. Even though Ruskin Bond says that he is not a nervous or an imaginative man, it's quite possible that he just imagined all this and none of this actually happened because of the circumstances in which he is traveling through the dark pine forest. And there is possibly some kind of a subconscious fear in him which makes him imagine that this is what has happened to him, the boy and then the watchman. And he has imagined not once but twice. The third possibility is that Mr. Oliver never met these two persons. Okay, and it's only the concern that none of these people should be outside the school that makes him imagine that there is one particular boy who is crying in the dark and he's a student of his school. Again, no imagination. The third point that I possibly think that maybe because he's coming from the Shimla Bazaar where there is a cinema, he probably saw a movie, he probably saw a horror movie, probably saw a thriller and he felt scared and he ended up imagining all of these. That's another possibility. Ruskin Bond does not tell us whether he went and saw a movie, but because he specifically mentions the Shimla Bazaar with its cinemas and restaurants, I see that as a hint that he possibly saw a cinema because of which he ended up imagining all these things. Now, what does the fact that the torch and the fact that there is darkness, what does it mean? After all, A Face in the Dark is the title of this story. Now, what we are seeing is that at the end of the story, the light goes off, the lantern also goes off, the lamp goes off and there is complete darkness, which means that Ruskin Bond is not offering us any hope as a result of this English public school education system. He perhaps wants us to know that there is really no light at the end of the tunnel. Have you heard this phrase? That there is no light at the end of the tunnel. And it is completely darkness. And in fact, darkness I see as a major theme in this particular short story because it is the darkness which prevents Mr. Oliver from seeing the face of the student or what he believes is the face. The torch is not able to illuminate through the darkness very clearly because the batteries are running out. At the end of the story, again, it is complete darkness because the lamp goes out. So, if you are looking at a recurring theme through the story, it is darkness which is the recurring theme because it is the darkness that Mr. Oliver is fighting against. On the face of it, the darkness through the pine forest, but at a larger level, the darkness that the education system is not able to illuminate, and the torch and its low batteries are a metaphor of sorts for the education system, for the fact that they are not able to be illuminated by Mr. Oliver and his education system. Okay. Now, just looking at all these points, Mr. Oliver, you have come to know what kind of a person Mr. Oliver was. So, when you are doing this story, what does it tell us about Mr. Oliver? You need to tell what Ruskin Bond says and also talk about what is the larger messaging from this story. We have known about the student, we know about the watchman. It's a supernatural element. As I said, this is something which is there in the supernatural, a product of his imagination. I spoke to you about the cinema, that he could have possibly seen a cinema, the fact that there is no individuality in the students, and that is a point perhaps that Ruskin Bond is trying to tell us. We spoke about the torch, we spoke about the fact that it's almost like a factory, the education system, and lastly the fear element. Even though Ruskin Bond says that he was not a nervous kind, obviously we realize the manner in which he runs through the forest after he sees the faceless boy, he is obviously very, very scared, and the manner in which he kind of pants and tells the watchman what he had seen inside the pine forest. So these are the basic elements of the story. We would be doing a video closer to the examination probably next month, looking at specific questions and answering them so that you could make your notes, so that if you have any doubts you could address them in the comment section below. There is also the email ID which has been given and you could write to that email ID. But don't forget to subscribe to the channel and also press the bell icon so that you can get regular updates on all the chapters and the motivational videos that we would be putting up at Study with Sudhir. Thank you very much for joining us here and look forward to seeing you on many more chapters of ICSE English Class 10. Thank you very much.